The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. I see people are streaming on here nicely. We've got a nice large group here tonight, all registered, so that's good to see. Can somebody just type into the answer box that they can see the screen okay, that it's the full screen, and that they can hear me okay, please? Bob says okay, perfect. Now, I'm just going to play around with this a little bit here. All right, so it's recording. So we'll just wait another minute here before we get going. All right, so we've got Bob, Elliot, Janice, Jennifer, Paul again, Scott Jones, Terry, Yusuf. Welcome everyone so far and still coming in, that's good. So we are just approaching the top of the hour here, and excuse me, tonight's webinar, just want to, perfect. Sorry, I'm trying to get my question box a bit larger. I'm not, there we go, that's better. So please do feel free to ask questions during the presentation. I may or may not answer them. I'm not trying to ignore you. I may not notice them as I'm going on rants and tangents and whatnot, but if I don't answer it during the presentation, I will definitely come back to it at the end. We will have time at the end to answer as many questions as you have. So let's get started here tonight. And so tonight's is a bonus live training web class. It was part of the promo for the last round of presentations that I did with respect to recruiting new students into the program. So as part of that bonus, we had a class last week. We've got one tonight about dealing with vendor takebacks or using no banks for the financing. And next week, I'll be going through a real deal with one of the students' real deals. So let's get started here tonight. What we're going to look at tonight is looking at a student deal using other people's money, a vendor takeback. We're also going to look at another scenario. It's sort of been interesting because I was going to focus specifically on one other student's situation, but since, well, just today, two other situations have arose that I will probably talk about as well. So, or arisen. So we'll get to those. But before we get going into the vendor takeback, it's important for you to know and understand all the different types of financing that are out there. It doesn't amaze me, but it's still, there is I take things for granted. I'm in the business, I'm in the industry all the time, so I see what's going on and I just make a lot of assumptions. For newbies getting in there, it is a very confusing environment. And even for myself, financing can be very confusing simply because they keep changing the rules all the time. And no two deals have ever been the same. So I can teach all kinds of lessons, and I'll never be able to cover 100% of every different scenario simply because they just keep changing all the time. What I want you to be aware of and learn is the basics, the fundamentals, so that you have a better understanding of how the system works. So we're going to quickly go through the different types of financing. Now, Commercial residential financing is like the building you see right here. It's all residential. There's no other commercial elements such as a storefront, storage lockers. There might be storage lockers for the individual tenants, but there's no rental units for storage lockers. Anything that is non-residential in this particular building. This is the type of building that I focus on. When I'm talking about financing, for the most part, this is the type of commercial building I'm looking at investing in. There's nothing wrong with the other types of commercial properties. They can be very lucrative. Those are not my specialty. Commercial residential is my specialty. That's what I know the most about. And that's what I focus on primarily during my teachings as well. And this is where you can get up to the 85% loan-to-value financing if you use insured financing such as CMHC. And you also get the extremely good rates that I talk about as well. And I'll be showing some of those rates later on in the presentation. We then have commercial non-residential. So the complete opposite of commercial residential would be commercial non-residential. A strip mall, where it's just all storefront, or it could be a small industrial park, a building that is a manufacturing building. That would be commercial non-residential, and it is viewed very, very differently from the bank's perspective than commercial residential. Commercial residential, from the perspective of a lender, is deemed to be very, very stable. Whereas the non-residential market, you could have a small strip mall with 4 stores in it, and you could run into some economic downturn in the market, and then you could have 2 of the tenants move out. Even though they've got 5 or 10-year leases, if they go bankrupt, they can't pay the rent, there's nothing you can do. And if it's in a downturn market, all of a sudden you're 50% vacant, and you can no longer carry or support the building. So this is why the banks look at the commercial non-residential to be a higher risk from their perspective. It can be very lucrative, financially lucrative for you when the going is good, but when the going is bad economically, it can be a money sucker. So that's something you need to be aware of, and that's the way the banks look at these as well. And then you've got mixed use, and a mixed use is, you can think of any small town or any community where you go into the downtown area and you've got 2- and 3-story buildings. The main level is going to be your storefronts, and then up above the storefronts you have 1 or 2 floors of apartments. That's what we call a mixed use. So it's got a mix of commercial, non-residential, and a mix of commercial residential. Now CMHC will still finance a building with mixed use, but only up to 20. They'll only allow up to 20% of the entire floor area to be non-residential. So if you've got a 2-story building, the entire main floor is commercial, the second floor is residential, then that's obviously a 50-50 split. That doesn't meet CMHC's standards, therefore it's going to be financed from a different perspective. So let's take a look at commercial residential a little bit more closely. First National is the lender that I use and have been using for many years now. There's no perfect lender out there, and I'm not going to say First National is perfect by any stretch. However, it's worked well for me. First National is also the largest single lender of CMHC. In other words, they actually place more than 50% of all CMHC insured commercial mortgages across Canada. So to me, that just speaks volume. They know what they're doing with respect to CMHC. They can't speak for CMHC, but they know what to expect from CMHC. So it's just easier to deal with somebody who knows the ins and out of the insurer. So First National will lend at a $500,000 lending point if it is insurable. In other words, if it is a commercial residential property, they will go to $500,000. If it is a mixed use, then again, it depends on the percentage of mixed use. If it's above 20%, then they will not be able to do CMHC. and they won't be able to touch it either. Now, if it's not insurable, they do not want to enter into a lending agreement for less than $750,000. And it seems silly, but when you understand where they get their money from, it makes more sense. So a lender like First National, they borrow from the bond market. I'm not 100% clear on how all of that works, but they borrow their money from a third party, the bond market. And there's a cost for them to borrow that and do all the paperwork, all the due diligence. And once they're committed to it, they're committed to it. So there's a little bit more risk as well. They do not feel it's worth their time to lend money out for a mortgage less than $750,000, which means that's $1 million property at a 75% loan to value. Now, the alternative is to go to a bank like RBC. Now, I'm using RBC specifically only because I'm currently involved with a student who is working through a commercial deal right now, and we are in communication with RBC. So the information is relatively fresh. Now, RBC will lend, and I know this from another student as well. So this other student has purchased mixed-use properties in the past year and a half, and has used RBC successfully. RBC can do insured financing if the property meets the criteria, or they can do non-insured financing as well. And they have two different divisions. So the business banking division, which is usually run internally in the local RBC branches or group of branches, they can do mortgages up to, I'll say $700,000. That's what I was told by this one RBC rep, but that can change from location to location as well. If the property is worth more than $700,000, then they get bumped up into the commercial, which is very similar to working with, say, First National. Now, when you're dealing with a company like RBC, and RBC, I'm just saying, it could be anybody else as well. It could be TD, could be Bank of Nova Scotia. When you're doing it through their business banking division, the cost of borrowing is going to be a little bit higher. Like the interest rates aren't going to be as good as the insured lending. And the reason being that rates are better through insured lending is that the banks can afford to discount the mortgages because they know they're guaranteed they're going to get paid. There's no risk. So they're passing that risk on to CMHC. If there's no insured party involved, then the bank is taking on a little bit more risk because there are going to be mortgages that go into default. So to compensate for that, they more or less insure themselves by increasing the interest rates a little bit higher. Also, when you're dealing with the business division, they tend to be a little bit more, well, there's no set rules or guidelines to follow. They also tend to look a little bit more at you, the individual, than, well, they still look at the property itself, but you become a little bit bigger part of the equation than when you're just dealing strictly with, say, First National or even RBC through CMHC. So here is I get a daily report from First National. That's Darrell Bellwood, the individual that I work with. I just cut and paste this on here. And these are the rates that First National pays to the bond market when they borrow money from the bond market to then in turn lend money to somebody like myself. Now, if these are insured rates as well. So when they look at the property, they're looking at the community. Is it in a city, or is it in a large suburb, or is it in some small, distant, remote community? So that will help determine the level of risk. That will help determine the interest rate that they charge. Is it a 5-year or 10-year amortization? If it's under $2 million, what they're going to do is they're going to add 1.5% onto either of these. See if you can see my mouse here or not. No, maybe not. Okay. Down on the bottom right in First National, you can see CMB or GOC, the rates that they have right there. What First National will do is they will assess the risk of the property, the value of the property, and they will add on, and I'm just picking a number here, 1.5% onto the rate if it's under $2 million. If it's a bigger mortgage over $2 million, then they may discount it and they'll add on 1%. So for example, at a 2-year or a 5-year rate, it's going to be 2.69% to 3.25% under the CMB bonds, or 2.24 to 2.71 under the GOC bonds. So you can see how the rates are considerably lower through the insured, but even then, it depends on the size of the loan, it depends on the location and the condition of the property as well. And at this point in time, it's not First National that approves the mortgage and the property that's being lent against or secured against. It's going to be CMHC. They're going to send their own appraiser out, their own team out to assess the value of that property. So then when you take a look at the commercial and mixed use, the insured lending does not apply. So RBC will lend through their business banking, as I mentioned earlier. The cost of borrowing can be significantly higher. Than the loan to value, and this is a big one, it can be as low as 60% and as high as 75%. So you're not going to get the 80-85% loan to value because it's no longer going to be insured. The interest rates with the non-insured, there's a variety of factors that are going to come into play here, and what they are going to do is they're going to assess every property on its own merits, case by case, so there's no excuse me, there's no broad guidelines. Somebody asked what CMB is or GOC. That is a very good question, and I wish I could answer that. That's just the acronym for the company that's providing, or not the company, but the service or provider of those bonds. I can't honestly answer that for you, Bruce. So the interest rates, if it's mixed use, current deal we're looking at right now, it's a 50-50, meaning that 50% of the floor area is commercial space with 2 storefronts, and then there's apartments upstairs. RBC has quoted 4.75%. Now, the gentleman that's looking at this, I know, is on the call tonight, and it's funny, people's reaction, and it's not just his reaction. I see this time and time again. People see that, you know, or they hear me talking about the low interest rates, or they hear other people talking about low interest rates. They see the houses being financed at 2.25%, 2.5%, and then all of a sudden they're looking at 4.5%, 4.75%, and that's quite a spread. Well, it wasn't that long ago that 4.75 would be a phenomenal rate, and it still is a really good rate. Even 5-6% is not a bad rate on a commercial property, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well. Now, the non-residential, the rates could range anywhere from 4 to 8%. It depends on the age of the property, the use of the property, the location of the property. There's a lot of different things that need to be taken into consideration when looking at this. If you are investing in small rural communities, then it might be worth your while also to talk to the local trust companies that, or farm credit unions, etc. They tend to work well with a lot of the local investors for these types of properties, because they first of all, it's owned and operated by the community, for the community, so they understand the value of keeping these properties going. So they're there to support. However, you're not going to get the insured lending rates there either, but sometimes it's not about, well, often it's not about the interest rates. It's more about just the availability and the ability of being able to borrow the money. Now, again, if you're looking at 4 units or less, that's going to be deemed to be residential, which is totally different than what we're talking about here today with respect to commercial. 5 units or more is deemed to be commercial. And this creates another challenge in the financing world. So what we're going to be talking about here today, it doesn't necessarily mean that it can only be applied to the commercial. You can do vendor take-back mortgages with a single-family house if you wish. But what I'm pointing out here in this particular slide is some of the challenges, not just this slide, but in the previous slides, the challenges that we face when it comes to financing these properties or being able to qualify for financing. So this is a big one. When you've got 5 units or more, it's deemed to be commercial. Now the price point for buying properties is anywhere between 60 and 120,000. Depends where you're buying them, the location, the condition, etc. So at $60,000 per door, a sixplex, you're looking at a $360,000 price point and up. Now the challenge here is that you're too big for the residential mortgages. So even if you've got a fantastic job and you can qualify for the mortgage, you can't get a mortgage because it's not a residential mortgage. And you're too small for the commercial lenders. So First National, for example, doesn't want to touch it because you're under the $500,000 to $750,000 range that they are trying to stay away from. They want the big deals. Bruce has lost sound. Can everybody else still hear me okay? Just do a sound check here. People hear me? Nope, I'm back. Yep, works well here. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep going then. I think it might be on your end then, Bruce. Okay. So the challenge here is that you're too big for the residential and too small for the big mortgage lenders. Therefore, what do? There are lenders out there like RBC, for example, and there are other lenders like RBC. They'll deal with you in not the commercial division though, but they'll deal with you in the business division. And again, you're going to pay higher interest rates. You're going to have to qualify for different things. And again, there's a student on the call here tonight who's had great success with RBC, as a matter of fact, doing the mortgages in this price point. It's just that it's not necessarily easy and it's not conventional. Therefore, anything that's not conventional and becomes a challenge opens up the door for opportunity to become creative. So that's where I'm going with all of this. So I'm trying to point out some of the challenges so that you understand if and when's a good time to ask for a vendor take-back, as an example. So let's jump into a student success story here. Here's a student of mine, a good friend, Larry Fisher. And Larry's first property actually was his own single-family house with a suited basement in it. But outside of that, his first purchase happened just this past September, took possession this past September. So over the course of the summer, looked for the property, found the property. It's a small mixed commercial property. You can see a nice picture of it there. It's in really good condition, great location, and there's 4 residential units and 2 commercial units. So we estimate that the percentage of floor area for the commercial space is approximately 40%. Doesn't really matter because it's definitely above 20%. Therefore, there's no chance of it qualifying for any form of CMHC financing. Now, the asking price was $350,000. Now, we felt that this property was priced fairly based upon the cash flow that it was generating. Again, the challenge, though, is going to be the potential for financing. It's not impossible, but we knew that that was going to be our challenge, and I think also that the seller knew that it was going to be a challenge as well. Now there's a rule out there, an unwritten rule. The easier you make it for somebody to buy, the more you can ask for that property. Or the easier you can make it to buy the property, the better the deal you can potentially get as well. So it's all about relationship, making it easier for the other person. So either the seller and or the listing agent understood this concept, and they mentioned early on, actually I think it was even in the listing, that seller-held financing was an option. They didn't give any details, they didn't highlight it or anything like that, but what that is saying to me as an experienced investor and realtor is that they understand there are challenges, potential challenges in getting financing for this property. Therefore, they're going to try and make it as easy as possible for a buyer to buy it. Therefore, it should sell quicker and more easily as well. So what we discovered is that the seller did not need cash for other investments. The property was actually free and clear, and this is extremely important to know because if, for example, you're buying a $300,000 or let's say a $400,000 property, and there is a $320,000 mortgage registered against it, then the chances of you getting a vendor take back of 80% loan to value is slim to none, because there's no equity there to lend back to you. So you have to understand the equity position on the seller side to see what options there are available. So in this particular case, we knew that there was no existing mortgage on the property. It was actually second generation ownership. The owner was just looking to retire. It was the only property he had. So he was very interested in holding a vendor take back because it's going to provide him with a steady monthly income as well. Now, the conventional financing, we would have been lucky to get 70%, more likely 65%, but we were able to negotiate. Once we were able to negotiate an acceptable purchase price, we then negotiated the vendor take-back mortgage at 80% of the purchase price. Now, we negotiated it at 4% interest. And we didn't even negotiate hard for that because we recognized that 4% was a good interest rate. Not a whole lot higher than what the insured lenders were offering, and definitely lower than what we could have got at RBC. So we're very happy with the 4% rate. Plus, we've also negotiated an option to renew at different terms 5 years in the future. So 5 years in the future, when that mortgage comes up for renewal, we can decide whether we want to negotiate with the original seller and see if we can get as good or better deal moving forward. Or at that point in time, the value of the property should have gone up through strict appreciation. The value of the property is going to go up. Actually, the value of this particular property is going to go up about $50,000 this month because of the new rents that he was able to negotiate. Larry's negotiating new rents for one of the commercial units, which increases the value of the property. So at the end of 5 years, he can decide whether to go to a conventional lender and finance it up to 80%, well, maybe only 70% of the value, or just stick with the seller with that VTB as well. So how can you create a similar deal? Well, again, you need to identify the financing challenges if there are any. And that's why I spent so much time going through all of the different scenarios, because that's how you will identify any of the particular financial challenges involved. Now, I mentioned that I'm dealing with a client right now who's on the call here, and we were sitting in the agent's office this morning, and one of the questions I asked was, would the seller entertain a vendor take-back? Because part of the challenge or concern is that we may only be able to get 65 or 70% loan to value, and my client only has X number of dollars. He doesn't have 35%. It's a stretch to come up with the 30%. But if the seller is willing to do a 10% vendor take back, a small second mortgage, all of a sudden it becomes much more feasible for my client to be able to buy that particular property. Again, you just asked the question. I wasn't pushing. We haven't negotiated for that because I don't negotiate for a vendor take back at this point in time. I wait until we find out what the financing challenges are going to be with respect to the lender. And once I have that, then I will go back and negotiate with the seller for a vendor take back. I'll get into that a little bit further here. All right, so the next thing you need to identify is the property free and clear, or what is the existing debt on that property? Now, your realtor can find out some history on the property. They can't easily find out what the mortgage balance is on the property. You can go to the local registry office with the address of the property and pull title to that property at the registry office. That's becoming more and more difficult to do because they're becoming more electronic and more centralized. So all the small registry offices seem to be disappearing. But if you have access to that, you can then pull the title for the property and see if there is a mortgage registered against it. It'll tell you what the mortgage is, the amount, but it will not tell you the rate. It won't tell you the balance, but it'll give you a rough idea. What conventional financing is going to be available for the particular property that you're looking at. So again, if it's commercial, 100% residential. You know that insured financing is an option, so you can go up to 85%. As soon as you lose that insured option, it goes down to probably 75% is the maximum that you're going to get conventionally. Most likely it's going to be between 65 and 70%. Always negotiate the acceptable purchase price first. One of the biggest mistakes investors make, new investors make, is they try and negotiate everything up front. And quite often that will overwhelm the seller and just turn the seller off, and they'll back away and look for an easier investor or a buyer to work with. So I negotiate simply on the price. I don't even try and get the best absolute price during the initial negotiations. I always go back and assess the price that we've negotiated based upon the condition of the property, the results of the inspections, the results of the diligence of looking at all of the numbers for the property as well. And if at that point in time I deem the property to be worth what we agreed, I'm happy. I won't renegotiate. But if I feel that the information doesn't support the price that we've agreed upon, then I'll go back and renegotiate a better purchase price. During the financing process, if I know that I'm going to be going for a vendor take back, about a third to maybe a halfway through the financing process, I will then approach the seller and say, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, we're having a real challenge getting the financing on this particular property. As you know, I would explain the situation, the unit mix, the commercial aspect of it. We can only get 65% loan to value. We need to get 75%. Will you do a vendor take back mortgage for the difference? If they say no, well, that's when you do the takeaway and you say, well, I guess we're going to have to let this deal go, but you still have it under contract. If they say no, and you threaten to take it away, in their mind it's been sold. They've probably spent that money 10 times over somewhere else and gone on vacations or whatever. So now it's a huge emotional letdown. So what you have to do is you have to educate them about the pros and cons of a vendor take-back. A lot of people are just intimidated about vendor take-backs, or they're ignorant about them. They don't understand the pros and cons. So that's part of your role, is to educate the seller through the other agent as well. So also, if they are adamant and they say no, well, that doesn't mean that you can't get secondary financing from another source. It doesn't have to be a vendor take back. It can be an RSP mortgage. It could be a line of credit from Joe Blow, a buddy, whatever the case may be. It gives you time to look elsewhere as well. All right, so negotiate the acceptable terms, including the vendor take back for 80% of the purchase price, or negotiate a second mortgage vendor take back behind the conventional. So in these unique properties, and again, it depends on the situation, because again, every deal is different, and you have to understand that every time you try this, it's not going to work. I don't know what the percentages are, but I mean, I'm working with a student right now where a VTB was not on the table, and we negotiated some pretty interesting price reductions already. Then all of a sudden they came back, because they're extremely motivated to get this deal finished. They came back with a vendor take back, an indirect vendor take back, where they would loan the money for the vendor take back, they would loan the money for the down payment in a sort of vendor take back, but it would be registered against another property, somebody else's property. So the bank wouldn't know that it's a 100% finance, basically. So you got to be careful of that, but I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be aware of how to structure it properly to stay on the right side of the rules and regulations as well. So there's many different ways of structuring these things and looking at them. So it sort of leads me to the next one here, where the size of the down payment is too large. So, what can you do? Well, you can ask the seller for a vendor take back in the form of a second mortgage, or ask the seller for a vendor take back against a separate property, or you can place a line of credit or RSP mortgage against another property as well. It depends on the lender. So I think that's what this is. Yeah, because it depends on the lender in first place whether they will allow a second mortgage or not. Now, for most commercial lenders, given the fact that they're only doing 60 to 75% loan to value, they are more apt to allow you to place a second mortgage of 10 to 15% behind them, because they are very well protected in that lower loan to value range. They will still want to make sure that the building, the property, can support that second mortgage through the cash flow. So they may have a condition that, yes, we will allow it, providing you show us that the cash flow can support it. So that's one option. The lenders, I won't say they want to know, they have to know where the down payment is coming from. FinTrack is a document that you need to sign. Now, I'm not sure what happens when you do a deal privately without real estate agents. I haven't done one privately. Given that I am a realtor, I have to do it all the time regardless. So I'm not 100% sure if you go directly to the seller, if you can avoid filling out the FinTrack, which is basically a 3 or 4 page document that explains where the money is coming from. It also explains who the person is that's providing the money, and it's a risk assessment to make sure that it's not laundering money for some ISIS or something of that nature. So it's a huge concern right now. We legally have to complete all of these documents in order to be compliant. It's a bit of a pain, but we have to show where the money's coming from. And the banks want to see that the money has been sitting in your account for at least 3 months prior to closing, to be sure that it's your money and it's not just money that's flowing through you from some biker gang or something like that. So it needs to be in your account for 3 months. So what you need to do is educate the seller about the tax benefits of a VTB, as well as the difficulty to finance that property, because a lot of times you'll find that for many people, the property we're looking at today, actually, it sounds like it's an older couple. Well, I know it's an older couple. Well, in their mid-60s isn't old anymore, I guess, but I have to be careful. But they're in their mid-60s. They've owned the property for 12, 13 years. They've done very little with respect to being compliant with a lot of rules and regulations, especially with the fire safety. It's not a major issue, but the point is, it's their mindset that they are very oblivious to the challenges that many people face when it comes to buying this particular property. They have no debt on the property itself. They do have a line of credit on their house they used in order to help purchase the property, which worked great for them, because when they bought the property, they would have had similar challenges with respect to financing. But they will have forgotten all of that. And they're just going to think, well, Joe Blow can go to the bank and borrow the money to buy this building. Case done. But the reality is it is difficult. So they need to be educated with respect to that. And in our case, we've got a good, I believe we have a good real estate agent representing the seller who understands that, and we can communicate with to express the difficulty. However, now is not the time, because we just got this property under contract. Now is not the time to raise that concern or issue. Maybe next week, once we get a better feel for what the banks are willing to do, we get a better feel for the numbers on the property, what are the real numbers, what's the real cash flow, what can it support, etc. At that point in time is when we will go back to the agent and say, in order to make this deal work, we need to have a vendor take back at these rates, under these terms, these conditions. So yes, you would ask for the seller for a VTB from the proceeds. Now, when people ask for a vendor take back, most people automatically assume that it's going to be directly from the proceeds of the sale. It doesn't have to be. So if there aren't enough proceeds from the sale, don't let that prevent you from asking, because maybe the individual has $600,000 in RSPs as well, or they've got access to a line of credit on another property. If they've got access to money elsewhere, they can lend the money from those proceeds just the same as they can lend the money from the proceeds of the actual sale itself. And because it's not going to be their property at the time that they sell that property to you, it's no longer theirs, therefore they can use their RSPs in the form of a second mortgage or even a first mortgage. So going back to Larry, for example, now we didn't do this with Larry's deal, but we could have asked, or we could have suggested, and it probably wouldn't have applied because the gentleman's older, he's over 70 anyways, but let's say the gentleman was only 50 years old and he had a bunch of RSPs. It might have been more beneficial for him to lend Larry, instead of 80% loan to value from the proceeds of the sale, it might have been better for him to lend Larry the same 80% but from his RSPs. So the money is growing tax-free inside his RSPs. Just a thought. Again, the money needs to be in your account for 3 months ahead of time. So let's take a quick look at an example here. So let's say we have a $500,000 property at 65% loan to value, means that we're going to have a mortgage for $325,000, but you only have cash available for 20%. Therefore, there's a shortfall of 15%, so you're going to need a vendor take back or some other source of financing for that 15% or $75,000. So you can borrow the $75,000 against your own personal property 3 or 4 months before you actually need it. Now, if you've got your own line of credit, you don't have to borrow the money 3 months ahead of time, because when you have a line of credit, let's say you've got a $100,000 line of credit, and it's sitting at zero, it's just sitting there waiting to be used. Whether you apply for a residential mortgage or a commercial mortgage, when they do the credit check on you and the credit worthiness, they're going to apply that $100,000 line of credit. They're going to take the payment as if it's 100%. That's because there's nothing to stop you from the day after you buy a property to go out and maximize that $100,000 line of credit. So they're going to make the assumption that you are going to maximize it, and they're going to take that into consideration when they're doing the calculations to see whether you can qualify or not. So given that they're doing that, you're actually allowed to use your own personal line of credit for the down payment of a investment property. If you do that, then you don't have to put the money in your bank for 3 months, because you can prove where the money came from. But if you're using somebody else's line of credit or some other form of investment like an RSP or somebody's cash, but they don't want to become a partner of yours. So again, I'm working with a student who's got one particular investor, potential investor, who is willing to lend a considerable amount of money at a very reasonable interest rate, around 4 or 5%, and it's cash. This potential investor does not want to be a partner, does not want to go on to title of an investment opportunity or property. They just want to be the lender. But they can't simply lend my student the money, because the bank's going to say, well, whose money is it? Where did it come from? If the investor was to lend my student the money for 3 months ahead of time, so have some planning ahead of time, you're going to be buying a property in the next 3 to 4 months, borrow the money, put it in. I've put it in at a cost of 7% here. That's going to cost you $1,300. That's going to come off the profit of this particular transaction. But now when the bank looks at your financial statements, they're going to see that this $75,000 has been sitting in your account for those 3 months. Therefore, it must be yours. You don't have to, you don't have to disclose that you've got an agreement to pay the investor 4 or 5%, whatever the number is. But it looks to the bank like you've got the money. Therefore, you can now go and buy that property and use the borrowed funds for the down payment, make your payment to the bank, make your payment to the investor. It cash flows positive still after all of that. Therefore, your returns are going to be infinite in this particular case. With respect to RSPs, same thing can happen there. You can, even if you have your own RSPs, the challenge with your own RSPs is you can't invest them in the form of a second mortgage in your own property. But what you could do a little bit of an end run. CRA may not like this strategy very much, but technically there's nothing illegal about it because everything is above board. You're still paying interest rates. So you could lend your money to Joe Blow, a good friend of yours, against his house. He's got equity in his house. So you lend $100,000 to Joe Blow at 4%, and Joe Blow turns around and lends it back to you in the form of cash at 6%. There's got to be something in it for Joe. So maybe, that 2% spread is something Joe can make a little bit of money on, and maybe you give Joe $5,000 as a finder fee or transaction fee, whatever you want to call it, in order to facilitate the deal, in order to make this work. So you've indirectly accessed your RSPs through somebody else. Your friend is protected. You're protected as well. There is some risk to that, because if your friend stops making payments on, or if you stop making payments, that can become a little bit of a nightmare. So you want to make sure you're doing it with people that you know and trust. There's always ways of looking at problems and coming up with solutions. The challenge is, more often than not, you need to be proactive rather than reactive. For many people, they get into the transaction, then they try and solve the problem, and they're under a time constraint. So it's better to be aware of what the potential problems are, try and get your game plan in place, your strategies ahead of time, and be prepared then so that you don't run into these challenges. Rates and terms, so you've probably heard me say very often that terms can be more important than rates. If you haven't heard me say that in the past, I've just said it now. And again, this is not frustrating, but it's people just don't get it, that it's the availability of money is much more important than the rate that you pay for the money. So for example, when I bought my apartment building, where I bought it for $225,000, and then I borrowed an additional $350,000 during the course of a year to do all the rehabbing and fixing up of the property. I was paying 12% interest for almost 14 months in order to make that project work. That property did not cash flow positive for those 14 months. It cost me money. The cost of holding all of that expensive money was just part of the cost of doing the rehab. Again, so going back to the property that we're currently looking at, and RBC is looking at financing, I think it's at, I forget now, 4.75% interest. Compared to 2.5, 2.7, yeah, it's more expensive. But if that property doesn't cash flow at 5 or 4.75, then maybe it's not a property we should be looking at, because what happens when the interest rates do go up 1% or 2%? You need to make sure that it's still going to cash flow when the rates do go up. So just something to be aware of. It's having access to the cash. When a significant line of credit is offered to me, I don't turn it down, because, I mean, for example, right now, I've got myself not into a serious pickle, but I'm tapped out with my money. I've lent my money out to a variety of different individuals, and it's all spread out, and I could use some of that money right now, and I don't have access to any more free money. I don't like that. That's not comfortable. That's not the situation I'm used to being in. So I'm going to get that rectified by the end of the month. But the point is, it's more important to have the availability of money than the good rates. Just be aware of that. If it has strong cash flow, then pay the price. And what I mean by paying the price, that could include the higher interest rates, but it's also going to potentially include finder's fees. So if somebody introduces you to a lender, that's worth money to you, and you want that individual to find more money for you, therefore you reward them. Same thing with the lender. This is more with the I was going to say private money, but not necessarily private money, because even with RBC and the big five banks and whatnot, when they're doing commercial, they will charge you a fee as well. They may call it something different, but these fees can be anywhere from 1% to 2% of the actual mortgage. And then if there's a broker involved, the only way that the broker gets paid is if you pay them. And it's going to be based upon the mortgage that they create for you. When a mortgage broker creates a mortgage for you for a residential mortgage, the lender, the bank, will pay the fees to the broker to put that deal together. In this particular case, the lenders do not pay the mortgage brokers. Therefore, that falls onto the shoulders of the borrower, you, and those fees can be anywhere from 1% to 3% as well. So actually, I today just received these, this was in the form of an email, and it's as a result of the property that I'm looking at with one of my students. And there was also a third option, but I didn't put that on here. It didn't apply. This is from a mortgage broker. Don't know who the lender is, but the lender could be an insurance company, it could be a credit union, it could be a bank. I don't know. The loan to value from his perspective, for this particular property, the loan to value is 65%. The rate is going to be approximately 4.1%. The term can be 1 to 5 years. The amortization is only going to be 20 years though, which means that that will make the monthly mortgage payment higher than if it was amortized over 25 years. The lender's fee, the money that the lender is going to charge to put this transaction together, is 1%. The broker fee is always negotiated. It has to be disclosed up front, but it's anywhere from 1% to 3%. Option number 2 is similar below. So what that translates into is, in our example earlier, if we have a $325,000 mortgage, that means the lender gets paid a fee of $32.50 just for doing the deal. Then they get the interest over the term of that mortgage as well. The mortgage broker, for putting the deal together, gets paid $9,700, so your total borrowing fees are $13,000 in order to access $325,000. The reality is that's the cost of doing business. You just have to accept that and work that into your cost of doing business. All right, so let's quickly take a look at some pros and cons of the vendor take-back from the seller's perspective, and I'm not touching on all of them. But from a seller's perspective, if they offer a vendor take-back, they can potentially ask for more for the property because, again, they're making it easier for you to buy it. Therefore, it's worth more. They also have the opportunity to charge interest, which is going to be more profit for them over the life of the mortgage. Tax benefits can be a huge one for them. It depends on their capital expense. So when they actually report the profits from the sale of that property, any capital gain has to be taxed in the year that it's received. If the capital gain can be spread out through the form of a vendor take-back mortgage, then they can spread those payments to the government out over 5 years, which could potentially reduce their tax payment. It's also, from a seller's perspective, it's a safe, secure investment because it's their particular property that is being secured with that mortgage. The cons, they're not going to receive all of their dollars up front, which may or may not be an issue. There's the potential risk of having to take the property back if you, the buyer, fail to make your payments and they have to foreclose on you, and that's not something they want to do. And this is a big one that for many sellers, it's beyond their context. You know, they believe that it's risky and too much work. They don't want to be bothered with it. So again, you, the buyer, if you're interested in doing this, you need to know the pros and cons and understand it inside and out to be able to educate the agents and or the seller themselves. From a buyer's perspective, the nice thing about this is that you may require less money. So instead of doing 70%, you might be able to get a vendor take back for combined up to 80-85%. You may not need to qualify with the banks. You can potentially buy more properties because you're having to use less of your money, and you're able to negotiate the terms. So going back to Larry's deal, for example, it was about 2 weeks prior to closing, we were talking, And he just casually asked me, when are they going to ask for my credit check, or when are they going to do any background checks on me? And I said, they didn't ask for any, they don't get any. And that's not unusual. I gave out a mortgage on a property that I sold a couple of years ago. I knew better, and there was 2 partners involved in the buying side. I asked for full disclosure of their financials as well as credit reports because I wanted to make sure that I was going to be paid on a monthly basis. But more often than not, the sellers will not even ask for, and if they do, it's very limited what they ask for with respect to qualifying. The cons of doing this is there's the opportunity, the potential that you could potentially overpay for a property, simply because they're offering a vendor take back, making it easier for you to buy the property, then there might be the tendency for you to pay more than what it's actually worth. So you got to be careful of that. It's also going to potentially reduce your cash flow with higher interest rates or the fact that there's a second mortgage. You want to make sure that you don't get yourself over leveraged and finance it for more than what's actually worth on the open market. All right, so very quick summary. Ask for the vendor take back during the diligence phase unless it's actually offered up front. Understand the current seller's situation with respect to debt, to try and figure out if a VTB is even feasible. Learn what they're planning on doing with the money, so to see whether they need the money to invest in another deal or not. When you propose the VTB option, you also propose all of the benefits. It's the educating of the seller. Threaten the takeaway to make it explain how it's too difficult to finance, therefore and be willing to walk away, because if you don't get it, maybe you just have to walk away from that particular deal. And also that brings me back to the cost of doing business. When you're playing in the game of commercial especially, nobody, myself included, likes to spend money and not get anything for it. However, sometimes it's worth spending money and losing money to walk away from a deal because you can't afford it, you're getting in over your head, or it's a bad deal, you discover something during the inspection, whatever the case. Sometimes it's okay to lose $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 on the attempt of buying a property. Nobody wants to do that. I get that. We try and spend as little money as possible during the diligence process, and we try and spend it in a logical time frame so that we don't, for example, we don't spend money on the inspection until we feel comfortable with the financing. Seller wants top dollars, therefore they should offer good vendor take back. So a lot of times sellers will ask more money than what the property is actually worth. In a case like that, a good way to come back at them with, if they won't come down in price to where it should be, tell them that you're willing to spend more money than what you believe the property is worth, providing they give you a vendor take back. However, in the vendor take back, there has to be some conditions, such as if you're saying that it's 100% occupied and has been for the past 5 years, great. As long as it stays 100% occupied, I'll pay you your monthly payment. However, if it drops below 5%, then I'm going to adjust my payments. If the rents aren't what you say they're going to be, then I'll adjust my payments, etc. So you can use that as a negotiating tool as well. Understand what the seller actually needs the cash for to determine whether a VTB is even feasible to ask for or not. And remember, if you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it. And there's nothing wrong with asking. You may want to change your language a little bit. You don't want to just come out and say, "Will the seller do a VTB?" Well, it sounds a little bit more aggressive than, would the seller consider helping me with seller-held financing? Same question, different tone. Just understand when and how to ask as well. And again, don't expect this to work every time you try. I'm going to suggest that it's probably, of the times that I've tried it, both for myself and with students, probably only 15–20% of the times it actually comes to fruition and actually works. But when it works, it's nice, it's beneficial. All right, so that's it for tonight. I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Oh, it's almost 10 o'clock. longer than I thought. All right, so we've got some questions here. Let me get my mouse. Bear with me. All right, so Bob says, when CMHC is evaluating a commercial residential property, do they use cap rate and NOI to determine economic value of the property? Who determines what the cap rate will be used? Yes, they do use the cap rate of that local area. So for example, I just had one of my properties evaluated, not by CMHC, but by a professional appraisal company. And they keep track of all of the sales in their jurisdiction, the area that they work in. So they know what the cap rates are. CMHC does the same thing. They've got a massive database of information to draw upon. So they will know what the cap rates are for the different areas. CMHC will also reach out to local appraisal companies to get an idea of what the cap rates are, to get a handle on things as well. So then they will ask for all of the financials for the property, and yes, they will base the, that's part of the process, is that they'll base the value on the net operating income and the cap rate, but they also will take a look at the overall condition of the property. They will assess whether it needs to have an environmental study or not. They will, I'd be willing to bet money that they will always ask for a phase 1 environmental study, which means that you have to pay somebody $1,000 to $1,500 to come out and decide whether there's any potential environmental risks. And then if there are any potential environmental risks, then you've got to go to a phase 2 and determine what those risks are, assess them. So there's a lot of different things that CMHC will look at. One of the most recent one that I did, they took a look at the condition of the property and said, yes, we will finance it. However, within the next year, you have to replace these windows and you have to replace, there were some decks I had to replace as well. So they actually identified what I had to replace in order to satisfy their criteria. And that's going to change from inspection to inspection or assessment to assessment, depending on who the individual is that comes out and looks at the property. Okay, Janice has a question. Is financing to purchase land for a residential commercial development handled the same as for a single residential situation? I can't say 100%. So I've only looked into this twice, but I never actually completed the transaction because the deal just didn't make sense. Both times, sorry, I'm just trying to think back here. Both times they would take into consideration the financing, and I think they would finance up to 75% of the value of the land and the construction, but they would only release money, like a construction loan, they would only release money in increments as the work was being done. With the land, they would release the 75% immediately because it was existing and there. What they really would like me to do, wanted me to do, was buy the land outright, and then they would do 75% of the rest of the transaction. So there's no easy answer to that question, Janice, I'm afraid. It's something that you need to talk to different lenders about, because they have different policies of how they handle it as well. All right, see if there's any other questions here. Oh. How much time would you typically allow to complete due diligence and arrange financing for, say, a 10-plus apartment? Okay, great question. It depends whether you're doing insured financing or conventional financing. So we just structured this deal because I knew it wasn't going to be insured financing. I gave 15 banking days, which is 3 weeks. The lender is saying that I should have given 20 banking days. So I will go back and ask for more time, just not yet. If it was insured financing, you would want a minimum of 6 weeks, because especially if it's CMHC, because you're now dealing with a government agency and we know how efficient all government agencies are and how quickly they move. So it just takes more time for them to do the entire process as well. So anywhere between, I'll say, 4 and 6 weeks is what you should be looking at. I would ask for 6 weeks, and if they come back, again, the challenge here is that quite often, especially on the smaller apartment buildings where you've got older ownership, long-term ownership, they don't understand the financing side of things. They get frustrated because they see that houses get financed in a week to 2 weeks at the most. Why can't this get financed as quickly as well? It just doesn't work that way. So therefore, there's some education to come into play here, especially if the listing agent is unaware of that as well. So definitely 4 weeks on the low side. Well, 3 weeks on the low side. 4 weeks is probably better to 6 weeks. If you ask for 6 and they knock it down to 2 or 3, then you bump it back up to 4 or 5 and just fight your case for it. And if you can't get it, just during your due diligence time period, spend as little money as possible. And before you spend any significant money, like $3,000 on a building inspection, for example, before you spend that, you go back to them and say, oh, the bank says I absolutely need to have more time. Give me more time or else I'm walking from the deal before you spend any more money. All right, so any other questions here? Give you a few seconds to type anything in. So we had a good group on the call here tonight. I'm just scrolling all the way back through here to make sure I haven't missed any questions. All right, well, that looks like that is it. No other questions have come in. So if that's it, we are over the hour as well, 10:05, so that's pretty good. Appreciate everybody being on the call tonight. I hope that was of value to you. If you have any questions after the fact, please feel free to email me. I will answer them as quickly as I can. Also appreciate any positive feedback as well, and it's always encouraging. And I guess that's it. So have yourselves a great night, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Take care now.